Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Depth Psychology Alliance panel discussion. Our topic today is From Sorrow to Soul, Finding Meaning in a Time of Loss. And I think we can all agree that 2020 has been a year of tremendous loss for many, many people. So what we want to do during our discussion today is to talk about loss, about dealing with loss, and about how we might consciously wrest some positive energy out of these losses. And we'll have a lot more to say about all of that in a moment. But first, what I want to do is thank the Pacifica Graduate Institute's Alumni Association, and especially Dianne Travis-Teague, for inviting the Depth Psychology Alliance to be a part of their wonderful 9th annual Toast Heard Round the World event. And Happy New Year to everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So I also want to thank our wonderful panel for joining us today and for sharing with us their expertise on this topic. I want to introduce them now, but I'm going to start with myself. My name is James Newell. I'm the director of the Depth Psychology Alliance. And the Depth Psychology Alliance is a global online village for discussion and development of depth psychology ideas and perspectives, as well as a place just to connect with like-minded colleagues. We support the mission of the Depth Psychology Alliance by offering college-level courses on depth psychology. We recently completed our fall course on Jung and Christianity, and this coming spring we're offering a course on Jung and astrology. Now, we're particularly fortunate on this topic to have with us an expert, Francis Weller, who is an author, a psychotherapist, and a soul activist. He's a master of synthesizing diverse streams of thought from psychology, anthropology, mythology, alchemy, indigenous cultures, and poetic traditions. He's the author of the wonderful book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Rituals of Renewal, and The Sacred Work of Grief. He's also published The Threshold Between Loss and Revelation with Roshani Ray, as well as In the Absence of the Ordinary, Essays in a Time of Uncertainty. He's introduced the healing work of ritual to thousands of people. He founded and directs the Wisdom Bridge organization, which offers educational programs that seek to integrate the wisdom from indigenous cultures with insights and knowledge gathered from Western poetic, psychological, and spiritual traditions. And you can follow Francis's work at his website, www.francisweller.net. We're also very happy and fortunate to have with us our friend and fellow board member of the Depth Psychology Alliance, Jeffrey Kiehl, PhD. Jeffrey is a diplomat, Jungian analyst, and senior training analyst for the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago and the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts. He is also an adjunct professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and an adjunct faculty member of Pacifica Graduate Institute, where he teaches a course on eco-psychology. Jeffrey is the author of Facing Climate Change: An Integrated Path to the Future. This provides a Jungian perspective on climate change. Jeffrey is presented on various Jungian topics at national and international conferences, and he lives in Santa Cruz, California. Finally, but definitely not least, is the wonderful Bonnie Bright, PhD. Bonnie is a certified transpersonal, soul-centered coach who uses Jungian, archetypal, and shamanic perspectives to help people navigate spiritual awakening. She holds master's degrees in psychology from Sonoma State University and in depth psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute, where she also completed her doctorate degree. So I'm sure many of you out there already know Bonnie. We're particularly fond of Bonnie here at the Depth Psychology Alliance because Bonnie created the Depth Psychology Alliance along with the Depth Insights Journal, which she served as the executive editor of for 6 years. And she is the founder and director emerita of the Depth Psychology Alliance. She's full of energy. She hosted over 100 recorded interviews in depth psychology, which many of which are still available on the Depth Psychology Alliance. And her newest offering is a 1-year certificate training program in soul-centered coaching psychology. And you can learn more about Bonnie's work at her website, www.depthinsights.com. And of course, all of our panelists, you can just Google them and you'll be able to find their sites, I think, pretty easily. Well, what we want to do today, our panel, as I've said, is titled From Sorrow to Soul, Finding Meaning in a time of loss. And our intention for this panel is to attempt to consciously address the massive losses that we have all encountered in this extraordinary year of 2020. Aside from the simple everyday losses that we've all experienced, those things like not seeing friends and family as much as we'd like to, not being able to go out and shop when we want to, not being able to travel as much as we might want to. In addition to these smaller losses and many other smaller losses, the enormity of the loss of human life that we've seen around us every day is really difficult for many of us to grasp. I'm sure it's hard for anyone to imagine being in a room full of 10 or 20 or 30 people just suddenly dying in front of you. And yet, over the last 10 months or more, there have been many hundreds of thousands, literally hundreds of thousands of such deaths just in the United States alone. There are healthcare workers across the country and across the world who have labored and labored just trying to save the lives of suffering men and women and children, only to watch them slip away one after another. Until now, the number, last I checked, is over 340,000 people who have been lost to this disease in the U.S. alone, and almost 2 million people worldwide. So the numbers are so staggering as to be numbing. The loss and the grief involved are far more than any one individual could possibly process or bear. We've now reached what I think of as archetypal dimensions of loss. It's way beyond the personal. Those of us who work in the field of depth psychology know all too well that such losses and emotions, the emotions that accompany such losses, do not simply disappear just because we are unable to metabolize them. They will fall into the unconscious and they will remain with us whether or not we discover ways to encounter them consciously. So what we want to do today is try to discuss ways by which we can remain conscious as we try to engage with both our personal losses and losses of the broader culture around us that we encounter every day. So what I want to do is we're going to each of the panelists will have a little something to say, reflect on these issues, and then we'll just open it up for discussion among us. So we'll start with Francis, and then Jeff, and then Bonnie. Francis, any thoughts?
I'm sure we all have a lot of thoughts about what's going on. And
Yeah.
I think one place to start might be to acknowledge that our evolutionary story has not prepared us for this moment. In a sense, our psyches cannot constantly process what I'm calling referral trauma. Every day we get news of more deaths, more crises, more tragedies, and we're not wired for this. So I want to just put a plug in for the value of numbing and dissociation and the necessity for that. And I think partly the reason why I value it is because the context in which we're being asked to process this grief is far from what we need in order to engage it. In other words, grief has always been a communal process. Throughout our entire species stories, grief has been communal. And suddenly it's been privatized down to a singularity, to my grief, to what's happening inside of me. And we even go to private practice to talk about grief. We're missing the communal response to grief. So I think the psyche wisely shuts down when the conditions needed for us to really engage the material are missing. So that's been a lot of what I've been trying to do over the past 20 years is to recreate that original matrix in which human beings can actually come together and digest grief side by side. And the process that happens in that context is so different than what we've been taught here. The privatization that we're forced to encounter really reflects a very heroic ideal. So we're supposed to rise above this trauma, rise above the grief, muscle our way through it. But as you said, James, that doesn't resolve the grief. It just distances the grief until it becomes what I often say. People come into my practice complaining of depression. And I often say, well, sitting with you, it's not so much depression as it's oppression. There is a weight upon you, a sediment that has come upon you that may be generations old, that has not been metabolized, has not been met with any kind of warmth. So part of our work right now is learning how to approach the grief, because basically we've not been taught anything about it. We are a grief phobic and grief illiterate culture. So when it arrives at our door, we don't know how to respond meaningfully. We're just hoping to get to the other side of it without being pulled under. So I think our work is to learn how to engage the material, as they would say in alchemy. How do we keep the material warm? Because when we try to distance it, when we try to distract ourselves from it, the material turns cold, and that's when it hardens and congeals, and then there's no movement. So the work is to become skillful at learning how to approach grief, how to recognize it not as something that wants to take us hostage, but as actually something that wants to ripen us and deepen us as human beings. If we don't have a good knowledge of grief, it's hard for me to really cultivate a sense of compassion for other people's suffering. And right now, the suffering is so immense. And the work right now is that we become immense. I have the honor of working at the Cancer Help Program several times a year at Commonweal in Bolinas. And these people arrive at my door in my groups, and I often say, you have been exposed to a rough initiation. You didn't choose this, but you've been thrown into something that is radically altering your life. And rather than, again, just trying to muscle through, the invitation at this moment is to become immense. What can I recognize about not only hope and love and connection, but also fear, panic, dread, despair? We have to get our arms around everything right now. That's really the request that's in front of us, to become immense, so that we can keep turning our face into the winds of grief, so that those who are standing around us, the children, the adolescents, they can see someone who has digested their grief. And in the long walk of grief, we become elders by that engagement. I think I'll stop there for right now. But much more we could say. Hopefully in our conversation, we'll get into a lot of that.
Yeah, thank you, Francis, for opening the conversation. For me, I think James mentioned this at the beginning as introduction. This is really a deep archetypal moment, I think, in the history of humankind. And it's when these sorts of events happen of this magnitude, they bring with them tremendous grief, overwhelming loss, and grief associated with the loss. But they also open us up at the same time to reach out. I think that's absolutely essential in working with grief of this magnitude, is not doing it alone. And isn't it ironic that this is a symptom that separates us, that keeps us separated, that's safe to be separated physically. But at the same time, it's a loss that wants us to come together. It requires us to come together, to suffer together with the grief that arises with all the loss. The root of loss goes back to words like to loosen or divide or to break up. And I think, that sense of dissociation that occurs when we're in the midst of loss, psychologically, socially, I think it's all unfolding right now. And the other thing that I've reflected on around this loss is the symptom, loss as symptom, which always leads us into soul, that opens us to the path to soul. And when I think of COVID, the pandemic, and also the environmental disruption that's been happening, that it will continue to unfold out into the future. Those are symptoms of something that's reflecting our dissociation from nature itself. I mean, look at where COVID came from. It was us being out of balance with the natural world, to the best of our understanding. That's where it came from, as well as many of the previous viruses. So this is a call that deep inside the symptom is a call for us to retrieve soul. Soul loss. And that's what we've collectively been suffering from for many centuries now, is a tremendous loss of soul. And the symptoms that we are experiencing now, especially now around the pandemic, but also around the environmental destruction, are reflections of our dissociation from nature, from a sense of wholeness. And so for me, I always come back, in terms of working with the grief, is for me the symbol of the mandala. And I've worked a lot with this, with people, in terms of, in Tibetan society, mandala is not only a painting, it's society as a whole, it's a group. And so when you bring together people to work with grief, you're creating a dynamic mandala. And so I would encourage people to gather safely. In other words, use the technology that we have. We're creating a mandala right here, right now, this afternoon, and to allow that to work with us, work through us. And there are alchemical, the alchemical stages are all present in what's going on right now, in terms of the nigredo, the dark depths that we find ourselves in, things falling apart, the heat that's being brought to us that can break things down, but also the invitation to reflect. I don't know how many people I've talked to that what COVID has forced them to do is to become more reflective. And loss invites reflection. So that's the albedo, that's the reflective process. And then engaging with the feelings, the images that arise, actively engage with them, relate to them. That's where the soul is calling us. And that is the citranitas. That's our conscious engagement with image through things like active imagination and dream work. And then the final stage is after we have engaged and learned from, become in relationship with, we need to embody what we've discovered, which is the rebedo, which is bringing flesh and blood to all of our inner work. And that involves the outer world, working with the outer world, being a part of actively being a part, doing what's required in this moment of tremendous loss. So all of those process stages are there. All the processes within the stages are present in the mandala that's available for us to work with and through the loss that we're all experiencing. And so the grief is a doorway to finding soul. And I think that's where I'll end.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, there's a lot there. It stirs up a lot in me. But Bonnie, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, also stirs up a lot in me. Thank you, Jeff. That image of the mandala is really beautiful and actually ties into some thoughts that I've been having. I'm not going to lie, this year for me has also been quite difficult. Starting with the COVID, I can point to a series of events in my own life that really did put me on a descent that was unexpected and also very difficult. And as I went through each of those experiences throughout mostly the spring and summer months, I was really trying to pay attention to what's happening here. You know, what is this? What's here? What's in it for me? What is the invitation? What is that doorway, Jeff, that you mentioned? And you know, what kept coming to me over and over and over again was at the worst times when I just didn't know quite how to hold it, and the news reports just kept coming in, and you know, all of that referral trauma that you talked about, Francis. It was so difficult, and what I kept just thinking to myself was just hold the center, hold the center, hold the center. And I'm sure most people that are listening to this right now will be familiar with Yeats's poem. And he says the first three lines of his poem called The Second Coming say, turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. And of course, when we think about that, we can put that also to your metaphor, Jeff, of soul loss, and how when we dissociate and when we become separate, cut off, because of our dissociation, because of those incredible feelings that we cannot hold, that things do disintegrate. And so it's interesting because many years ago, I was in a retreat, a very intensive retreat, and I remember the instructor standing at the front of the room, and he was holding two publications. One, I think, was like a Time magazine, and one was maybe the New York Times. And both of them had headlines that were talking about primarily environmental and climate change issues. But the discussion was, you know, there's some difficult times ahead of us, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. And I remember just having this profound sense of, you know, almost dread, I guess, because of the way that we were talking about it. And at that time, the instructor said something like, there's going to be a real need for a few people who know a few things. And what he meant by that was for some of us who could understand what was happening here and to be able to do our own inner work enough, to be present enough with what's going on in the outer world, that we can almost perhaps act as anchors or as containers, or to help to contain what's going on, as pillars perhaps when the sky is falling. And so that was a turning point for me, truly, and it put me literally on the path of depth psychology. And I went straight from there into a master's program in depth psychology that summer, and it has moved from there. And so my work now is really to understand how I can hold it without going flying off, you know, into the cosmos, as sometimes that, you know, intense pressure and grief does take hold. And so I really appreciate the invitation aspect that you have both mentioned, and how when we look at what's happening around us, there are two ways that we can perhaps work with what's going on here, that we can attempt to hold our own center so that we can, in ways, allow all of that chaos that is happening around us to sort of spin around that center. It comes back to that mandala image again. And one way is, of course, to do our own inner work. So we have to show up for ourselves. If we have not worked through our own childhood wounding and all the coping mechanisms that we tend to find within ourselves as we begin to look, if we have not established a connection with something that is much bigger and much deeper than the ego self, then there's no way that we can possibly hope to hold that center, even for ourselves, let alone for other people who are struggling. And so that is to do our own inner work. And I really love a story that Marie-Louise von Franz tells about the mountain pine tree. And she talks about this in the context of individuation. And she says the mountain pine tree, and if you ever see pictures of this tree, it's these twisted trees that are low to the ground. I'm sure, Jeff, you know these because they're probably very prominent in your area. But they face these winds, and elements that are so destructive, but they have this way of just making their way in the world and living. I mean, they have life to them. And she says something in her, when she's telling this, she says something about like the tree, you know, does it complain when it meets with a rock? No, it doesn't complain. It just flows, it just grows around the rock and just keeps on growing. And so there's this way in which, as we each do our inner work, we can begin to find that strength, that resilience in ourselves, and the roots, of course, rooting down into the earth and knowing and feeling, getting that felt sense of how we are supported and held. And then the second way, and I'll just mention a couple of things here, and then perhaps we can come back to this, but that is the absolute value of ritual and how greatly it's needed in our society to be able to hold this space, to hold the center that we're talking about. And Mircea Eliade, who's most people know he's a tremendous religious scholar and wrote the book called Shamanism. And he talks about how it's really important that ritual is the bridge between, or the portal between, the ordinary and the sacred. And so ritual can really give us that structure, that container, or that doorway to be able to stay connected with that something bigger that we really need. And so a few years ago, I had the opportunity to work on an archaeological dig in Belize, and it was an ancient, a site for the ancient Maya. And they had completely collapsed over the course of, after about 2,500 years of being very vibrant. They were super advanced in mathematics and astronomy and calculating, and yet they collapsed as a society. And so I took a strong interest in that and really went into figure out what that meant for them, what it meant for us, what was happening there. And as I worked on that archaeological site, I discovered that the Maya were known for, when they left at the very end of their civilization, as the cities started to be abandoned. And nobody's quite sure why. There's a lot of theories, and we can go into that, primarily ecological, Jeff, so I know we might have some discussion about that. But what they discovered was that a lot of those cities that had been abandoned, as they dug down to the stairways off of the large platforms where the cities were based, at the bottom of those stairs, there were a lot of items that were just collected at the bottom. And it was like shards of pottery and beads and jewelry and tools and all of these exquisite, beautiful items. And so one theory, of course, was, they just threw everything that they couldn't take with them when they left those cities. But those items are really quite exquisite and quite beautiful. And so another theory is that these are termination deposits, and that perhaps there was something that happened as they were leaving that was a ritual that allowed them to really acknowledge what was going on, to voice it, to talk about it, and then to bring some of that grief and terror and uncertainty that they were experiencing, and to bring that into the world of form in a way that did create that bridge between the sacred and the profane. And so there's a lot of ways that we could possibly conceive of doing ritual in our society today. And I think it would be so greatly needed. James, you mentioned the sheer number of deaths. I don't think we can even begin to comprehend what that means. At least I can't, speaking for myself. And yet ritual is something that we can each do, either individually or in groups, small groups, or in large groups, or online. There are even ways to do it online. And I know, Francis, you've done a lot of that work, and you probably will have something to say about that. But in fact, I think I will leave it there and just open that up to see what comes out of that next.
Thank you, Bonnie. Yeah, that brings us back around to what Francis was saying about private and communal grief, because one of the things I mentioned when we all got together before was that I haven't seen anything. For example, 9/11, once a year there's an observance. There's no way to annually observe this. There's been many multiple 9/11s have happened from this experience that we're still in the midst of, and they say it's even going to get worse. And there's been no, I mean, we're lucky if we can even get the sort of on the ground, grounded in the world work done, but there's been no communal observance of the fact of the loss. The one reason, we were moved to talk about this now. And another thing, just, and I'll leave it to you guys because I know you've got a lot more to contribute, but it's something that Jeff said that I think also opens up a lot was that the idea of it being a symptom, and it reminded me of the idea of the presenting problem that someone brings into therapy. They bring in a presenting problem, and this whole pandemic is like a presenting problem,
Mhm.
and that civilization has failed in so many. Our modern world has failed in so many ways, and this is kind of the presenting problem, and we have an opportunity. How many of us will address it? I don't know, but we have an opportunity to look at the underlying causes, the real kind of driving energy behind the presenting problem. But I'm interested in what other people think.
Well, I just want to respond. I think it's hard to establish some sort of a ritual commemoration when the dying is still taking place.
Hmm.
I just I can't imagine that would happen until, and hopefully we will get through, COVID. But it's only after that that I think I could imagine there'll be some collective honoring of those who were lost. But we're not even at the peak according to all the projections. I mean, we're really in the midst of the whole sorrow, dying, death process.
Certainly been asked many times to do some kind of ritual response to what's going on. And I don't know if we're really ready for that. Kind of what you're saying, Jeff. In some ways, when I get a call from somebody whose, brother or sister committed suicide, or their partner died, or their child died, or something going intensely wrong in the community, we have to process the trauma to a degree first.
Yeah.
Before we can really enter, in an unprotected way, in a contained way, into the vulnerability of our grief.
Mm-hmm.
The trauma has its own response, its own necessary response to the circumstance. So I think we are digesting what's going on to some degree. And so rather than doing online rituals, I've done a couple, what I call an apprenticeship with sorrow course. How do we develop the skill to stay present? Because grief is not just an emotion, it's a core human faculty. And very few of us have been taught the skills of grief. So how do we cultivate that ground in order to not go into amnesia or anesthesia, the two primary sins of our culture, where we go numb and we just disappear and dissociate and forget our interconnectedness, which, by the way, I think is one of the ways the symptom of COVID is affecting us. I think it is having this amazing impact on our ideology of individualism. It's kind of shattering that fantasy that I am my own private, isolated, separate self. I am as vulnerable as every other human being on the planet right now, and we're sharing something profoundly, widespread, touching every part of the world. So anyhow, the apprenticeship, I think, is a very important part. How do we cultivate the skill to stay present to what is happening? And I think I said to the three of you yesterday that in some ways COVID is like the first wave coming ashore. It's the first most intense wave we've had to encounter. We've been able to deny climate change to a degree, but the waves are going to be coming. And how do we fortify ourselves? Maybe COVID is, an opportunity for us to really undertake this apprenticeship and become more capable of staying present to whatever comes. I'd be happy to talk more about that as well. But I want to hear what you think about that.
Could you say something about I'm interested in, if there's a distinction between, for example, you mentioned about we're in now the midst of trauma, the trauma of what's happening, and what's the distinction between an apprenticeship with sorrow and an apprenticeship with trauma? Is it would you say they're spectrum, the same, on a similar
Well,
spectrum?
every trauma contains grief, carries grief. Not every grief carries trauma. So whatever the apprenticeship is, it's widespread in terms of what it is that is entering the room of our own house, our internal house. We can then have the capacity to meet it, whether it's trauma based or the delicate loss of a pet, something that you've cherished for a long time. That's not a traumatic thing so much, but it is a sorrowful thing, and we still want to stay present to that. That requires skill. The old idea of apprenticeship was that you would study something for a long time, 5, 10, 15, 20 years before you would be called a master, a master weaver or a carpenter or whatever. In the work of soul, the apprenticeship of sorrow doesn't lead to mastery, it leads to elderhood. That's the ripening of us by cultivating that skill set over many, many years of digesting trauma, loss, trouble, grief. That's the prima materia, right? That's what's in the vessel right now. And our job is to keep it warm, keep it cooking.
Yeah, thanks.
I think another important distinction to make is around loss is the difference between experienced loss and anticipated loss. We are experiencing loss every day, the numbers that you cited. We are experiencing loss related to climate change. I mean, the fires that have been very destructive this year around the world, especially here in California. Those are losses that we are in the midst of, or we can look back at and feel the grief and the sadness and the sorrow. But then there's the loss that's looming ahead. And it's there with COVID as well as climate change. How many more people will we lose? Will I contract COVID? If so, how severe will it be? What am I going to lose next year if there's a fire near me or whatever? Those are losses that we anticipate, and the reaction that comes with that is more anxiety than grief or sorrow, because it hasn't been experienced, but it's still there. We're experiencing it psychologically, somatically. It's having an effect on us. And so we need to learn how to work with both the losses that we are experiencing and have experienced, as well as the loss that we're anticipating and its effect on our psyches. And I think, Bonnie brought up ritual. That's an area where ritual is very important, because it provides a container to work with that anxiety or with the grief. So, this is, and not everybody's going to want to do that, and not everyone is, trained in that or has experience in that. And I think perhaps this is, Francis, your idea of the elders. There's going to be more and more need for people that are willing to work with experienced loss and anticipated loss, with the grief, the sorrow, and the anxiety. And for me, I'm biased, but a depth psychological approach for me is the path that I think provides a tremendous opportunity for working through, living with those experiences of loss, be they past, present, or future.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I wanted to just interject one more wrinkle to this, and I know Bonnie's got some to add too, but um, one of the things I know my own personal losses around COVID specifically have been relatively bourgeois, just kind of I'm very fortunate to be in a safe place and to be able to take care of myself. But one of the things that, as I say, this, sort of presenting problem of COVID, or the symptom of COVID has revealed is which many people we already know, but really revealed in tragic and fatal ways is the inequities of racial bias and the healthcare system. It's so drastically more severely affecting Native people all around the world, certainly in the United States, African American communities and Latino communities far, far disproportionately more. And this is just, it's this disproportionate services and everything has been going on for a long time, but this is being more and more revealed. It's in just another way in which this presenting problem of COVID is revealing many of the wounds and the weaknesses of our supposedly free and equal culture. So I just wanted to, I'd feel remiss if I didn't bring that into the mix of what we're talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, James. If I may, I'll just jump in pick up, I guess, from Jeff's comments on loss, and also just to bring that in as well, James. One thing that we all have as in common as human beings is loss. That's one thing that none of us can escape. It is that common thread among us, and it's so important that we be able to feel that sense of connection with one another. There's been so much polarity and division in our country, particularly, but in the world, of course, around us, and the issues with different people and different cultures and different worldviews, and it's very challenging for us sometimes to know how we can help, or how we can jump in, or how we can even hold that in so many ways. And so I keep coming back to this idea that we absolutely have to be able to feel connected to something bigger than ourselves, than our everyday ego selves, right? We have to be connected with soul, a sense of soul in some way, whatever that means for you. And of course, there are numerous ways to do that. When I was speaking of ritual earlier, one ritual that came to mind, which I think probably came from you originally, Francis, actually, I think I heard that somewhere from you, was the idea of being able to take, for example, a bowl of water and name your grief into a stone, and then put the stone in the water. And you could even do this with a group online, because each person, as they put a stone in their water, you get the sense of how the water is really the field of sorrow that we are all swimming in. And it gives us that opportunity to be connected. And also, along with that sense of connection to soul, of course, comes the feminine. We are so logical and rational in our culture, and so focused on what Jung referred to as the masculine way of doing things, which is always going after things. And we neglect sometimes the eros, or the feminine, which is the relatedness, the connection, the sense of connection. Sometimes we can't even feel it. And sorrow and grief can put us very much into silos where we feel like nobody can possibly understand our grief and our trauma. And so again, so important that we find ways to connect with soul in whatever way that means to us. Obviously, one obvious one that comes to me, I guess I would say, is nature. If you have access to nature in any way, it's so important to just go sit with a tree, and I don't know if anybody saw it, but the New York Times recently published an article from a woman who has done a lot of research on trees and the root systems, and how what she calls mother trees are actually sending resources out to the other trees around in her area. And I was familiar with that because I had touched on that in my dissertation a little bit, but this whole idea that we are all connected beneath the surface, we may not see it, above the surface, and sometimes not even be able to feel it. But the idea that we are all connected. And I have this one quote. I didn't, prepare a lot to read, but I really wanted to read this one quote from Jung, which I'm sure most of you will be familiar with. It's so beautiful. He says, "Life has always seemed to me like a plant that lives on its rhizome." And of course, the rhizome meaning that root system that goes down into the earth. "Its true life is invisible, hidden in the rhizome. The part that appears above ground lasts only a single summer. Then it withers away, an ephemeral apparition. When we think of the unending growth and decay of life and civilizations, we cannot escape the impression of absolute nullity. Yet I have never lost a sense of something that lives and endures underneath the eternal flux. What we see is the blossom which passes, the rhizome remains." And so this sense that, no matter what is going on in the chaos around us and the grief that we feel, if we can somehow find a way to connect down into that rhizome, all those roots are feeding each other, connected with each other. And this, the idea of the mother trees. So in the end, it all comes down to love, right? In some cultures in history, Egypt being one of those, they paid mourners often for funerals. That was just a calling that some people had, and that was their work, was to be a mourner. And these usually were women in this case, and the women often had the images of the goddess tattooed on their shoulders. And so again, that just brings in that sense of knowing and connection that we are loved, that love is really that water that we're swimming in. And if there's a way that we can get into that, that is what will help us to hold the grief. But it's the connection, it's the great connector, right? It's the thing that brings us all together. We have to find ways to find that for ourselves so that we can tap into that network for and on behalf of those who aren't able to feel it at any given moment.
Thank you, Bonnie. Yeah, I was reminded when Jeff was talking about the mandala and the idea of the connection with sort of indigenous people and with our own ancient souls, is that for millions of years we were in small tribal 25 to 50 people groups, and we sat around fires, which was a little mandala, a little circle.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're used to being in the circle around the fire. I also was reminded when you talked about the stone in the water, there's a ritual in India around a fire called the Duni fire, where people will typically, they'll take if they have a habit or something they want to give up, they put it on the stick and they throw it in the fire. But also, like you were saying, the grief or the whatever it is, you can throw that into fire. It's just another example of a ritual we can do to take care of those things. Well, we have 11 or 12 minutes left, but I wonder if people have some closing thoughts we could kind of bring things together.
That ritual is one we've done many times, Bonnie. Part of the beauty of the ritual is that as you put your stones in the water, and particularly if you're doing this with a group of people, you begin to sense, this is not my grief. This is our grief. This is the communal cup of sorrow. And again, breaking out of this idea of separation and disconnection from one another. So ritual is a way in which you bridge that common ground, what I call the commons of the soul. When we do our grief ritual gatherings, which last 3, sometimes 4 days, people come from Australia and from England and from Canada, all across the United States, just for the privilege to grieve side by side with another human being. That's really at the heart of our grief. It's how much we have forgotten these common practices of this should be, if we were a sane culture, we would have grief rituals in every community at least once a month, if not twice a month, just to keep the cargo of sorrow moving through us. It's not meant to congeal and harden in our hearts. It's meant to be moved regularly and to kept, fluid and soft. But that's an intelligence that I hope we're beginning to gather back to us again. Is the absolute necessity of ritual as a way of titrating trauma, of recalibrating after losses. How do we stitch the code of belonging back together again? How do we knit the community back into something whole and sustainable? That's really the core purpose of ritual practice. Yeah.
Well, I guess I'd like to just end on touching on something you were talking about, Bonnie. For me, what carries us through these times, and we will need more and more of in the oncoming years, is a connection to the transcendent, a connection to that archetype of wholeness. Jung used the word self, the big S self. I prefer his other phrase for that, which is the archetype of wholeness. And, we tend to reflect on that as it's a wholeness within us that we seek through our inner work. But Jung made it clear in a conversation once that those individual senses of wholeness are actually, in some sense, an illusion, because ultimately, all of those seemingly separate inner senses of wholeness connect to and are a part of a wholeness that transcends space and time. It transcends everything. It's completely ever present. It's always available. And it doesn't separate us. It manifests and reminds us that we are truly all interconnected. Okay? And so it's remembering that. It's actually in these moments of dissociated loss, of the breaking up, that we can remember, not just do the work of our inner self, do the work to connect to that sense of wholeness within us as individuals, but in the process, experience that sense of wholeness that unites everything. Mm. Okay, that's really where we're at. This is in this archetypal moment in history. We're at the cusp of, are we going to be able to manifest that or not? If we can, we're going to avoid tremendous catastrophe. If we can't, then we are going to experience more and more catastrophe. And it's a difficult thing to grasp, and we want to deny that. We want to run from it. But if you look at things archetypally, that's where we are in history. That's where this human civilization is. Probably the most critical point in the evolution of our species. And the question is, are we going to do that? Are we going to experience that true connectedness to the transcendent? We have the ability and capability. That's, it's for Jung, it's instinctual within us. We just need to work with that instinct.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. That reminds me of Jung. Of course, Jung was asked, will we make it past these catastrophes? And he said, if enough people do inner work.
Right.
And that's, Bonnie, you have any thoughts?
A few. I will try to limit it to our time here. A couple of things, actually. Again, I'm coming back to that idea of holding the center, and that's so important in the wholeness. We cannot have wholeness unless there is a center to bring all of those parts of the soul back to. And I'm thinking about the image of the central fire and how we have to find that central fire in us and reconnect with it. And if you don't feel like you have that, it's not a very easy thing to do. because there's nothing there to gather together. So we have to absolutely find that center, and part of that is being able to revision, to come together in the midst of chaos. Michael Meade tells a really beautiful story, a Native American story, about an old woman who's weaving, and she's weaving the threads of life and existence, but at the same time she's cooking in a pot over in the side the seeds that feed that plant, our future, our existence, our being. And she has to leave her weaving at some point to go take care of the pot, to go stir the pot so that it doesn't burn. And while she's away stirring the pot, the black dog comes along and finds a loose thread and unravels all of the weaving that she's been doing. And when she comes back, there's all of her work just in a pile on the floor, a tangled pile of chaos, right? And so, as he tells it, she sits back down and she picks up a thread and she begins to weave again according to a new vision that she has. And so it's that, people talk all the time, at least that I hear about, when things go back to normal again. But things are never going to go back to normal again. We're on Jung's spiral, we're moving. And hopefully as we come back around and meet each new chaos, as this one begins to subside, we will be on a different level. We'll be looking at it from a different perspective. We'll be different people. But we have to reconnect with that fire within. It's so important. And one way is definitely through community. One way is through working with somebody else. We cannot do it alone. It's so important. So, whether you find a therapist or a coach or just a good friend or a group of people. I know Jeff and I have been in a dream group for several years that meets online just like this. We're on 7 of us on 3 continents, and we have had the most amazing, remarkable discussions. And that has been something that has really carried me over the last few years, and definitely this year, as all of us have been, confined to our homes and not able to go out. So that's how we do it. We connect with one another. Find somebody who knows something, a little bit about something, right? Like the instructor told us, me at the beginning of the that I mentioned at the beginning, and I'll just leave maybe one last image, and that is that in some indigenous rites of passage, when the initiates, the youth who went out into the wilderness to do their initiation so that they could come into adulthood, when they came back through the village, the villagers would open the doors as they passed to honor them, to mark their return home, and so that everybody could participate in that homecoming. And so this is so much a part of us coming home to ourselves so that we can then be able to hold that container as much as possible for what's going on in the chaos in the outer world, to hold that vision.
Thank you, Bonnie. That's beautiful. It's a nice way to end. I want to thank everybody. Francis, thank you so much for joining us. Francis Weller, Jeff Kiehl, thank you so much. Bonnie, thank you. I want to remind everybody, coming up next is going to be Kim Hermanson doing a lovely presentation. And at 2:45, I'm going to do a little original music if you're still hanging around, so please come back for that. And I'm going to turn it over to the hosts, the graduate, this Alumni Association, whoever is running all this. Thank you all very much for letting us have this, what for me was a very meaningful and moving talk. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, James. Thanks. Yeah, and thank you all.
Good.